Question of the day. Is it better to live in an overt autocracy like China, or are we happy with the situation of a fake democracy that is, I guess, runs by dividing people up, keeping them terribly educated and hateful, psychologically ill-prepared for life. So if you were to compare China and the United Kingdom, for example, if you look at the number of people that have been opposed in the UK to the major issues of the last 8 or 9 years, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's got to be at least 30%, if not higher. And of those that fall outside of that 30%, at least some of them would want to hear a counter view. So imagine whatever you think are the biggest 4 things that have happened in the last 8-9 years. Let's say a third of the country is in opposition to those things. Where would you find their representation? Would you find their representation, for example, in Parliament? No representation in Parliament. In the mainstream media, no representation there, and no representation among the institutions or among the establishment class. So I think it's an interesting one. I think that, for example, as a thought experiment, imagine if that third were to grow. Now, this is like testing the idea of democracy. So imagine that third were to grow and becomes 2/3. Would the representation of those counter ideas to the establishment change? Would they say, oh, you need some representation now in Parliament because you're 2/3 among the population? I don't believe that. I think what would happen if that dissenting third were to become 2/3, nothing would change. The mainstream media would continue to represent the establishment. Parliament would do the same. And the establishment itself would obviously stay the same. So for me, that means it's not a democracy. I was going to say not really democracy. It's not a democracy at all. So we've got no representation of any dissenting voices. I think, as we've seen, it's the same in Europe. So then that begs the question, what's the point of it in the first place? They don't have these divisions, for example. I don't see anywhere other than in democracies. And these divisions, they're not intellectual divisions. They're divisions of hatred, wound up by the intel community. They're never counter political positions. They're kind of tribal, emotional positions. So what's their purpose? They don't serve a purpose other than the establishment can say that we're a democracy, but what does it even matter? It's just a word at this point. I mean, the Soviet Union called itself a democracy as well. Lots of countries call themselves democracies. But this idea of ruling over everyone and just forcing the word. I mean, Orwell said, when democracy falls, it will fall, but it will retain the word because it's got such a positive connotation. So maybe it's the positive connotation attached to the word that the establishment likes so much. But at the end of the day, it seems to do more bad than it does good. So I think we should do away with the pretense and just say, listen, this is how it works. You're not in charge. At least then, for example, you could be more like China in the sense that the Chinese don't teach their kids all the nonsense that they teach Western children. They say, listen, you do engineering, you do medicine, and you leave the governance to us. In the West, you've got like 14-year-olds that have been politicized, always, as I always say, in favor of the government. Someone was talking about protests in the UK the other day. The protests, I can't believe people don't notice this, but the protests are very rarely, if ever, anti-government policy protests. They're always protesting in favour. They're always protesting in favour of government policy, which for me makes it look like the UK some kind of Orwellian joke. So any counter protests to the government itself, or the establishment itself, well, you'll kind of know how they're dealt with. So I suppose the question is do the benefits of calling yourself a democracy, do they outweigh the negatives? And I don't think they do. I don't think they do. I think that the countries that are up and coming, so you can compare, let's say, the UK with China, and well, let's say the West versus the rest, at least in terms of the large powers. What people often forget is to compare the direction of travel. When you look at the direction of travel, Russia and China, you look at our direction of travel, and it's not as if anyone has any reason to believe that trend is going to change. So I think that they are better positioned. They're going to have a much, certainly in terms of things like population psychology and mental health and things like this, I think Russia and China, if they haven't got there yet, they're on the right path. And I don't know what kind of what kind of direction we think the UK is going to end up in, but there's no democratic mechanism for anyone to do anything. I was saying to someone on Substack that in the United States they've got two power structures. Even if you don't like either of them, at least they can be played off against each other. The only power structure in the UK and Europe is this globalist, like oligarchical monolith, and they control the narrative on both sides of the mainstream, so the mainstream left, the mainstream right. So one thing I was saying online the other day is something that I wish I could draw more attention to. That if you take the divisions that exist, political divisions, they're very much among people that consume mainstream media. If you listen to the intellectual left and the intellectual right, they agree on almost everything, and they get on. Like interpersonally, they get on. Which, see, when I was younger and I was put into like this kind of herd of you've got to be on this side or the other, the amount of content that I used to miss, because I was labelled more on the conservative side, and so I used to attach labels to people that were on the left. Now, there's plenty of people at the high end of the left that just think exactly the same as people that are on the intellectual high end of the right, which just goes to show that it's ideas that the establishment find frightening. And if you can stupefy people get them to not like each other based on emotion and tribalism. What they don't want you doing is having getting anywhere near to truth, because that's what they find most dangerous. And in my experience, in the last 10, maybe 5-6 years, is I've noticed that there is an international movement of intellectually curious people that come from originally perhaps a left-wing background or a right-wing background, but they're intellectually confident. They don't mind admitting that they've been wrong in the past, and they agree on almost everything. The only difference I might notice is there's a slight personality difference, but who cares? They get on very well, and they agree on the issues. So yeah, this idea of giving people the worst education imaginable on purpose just to keep them down so that you can continue to call yourself a democracy, I think it's such an ugly way to govern. It's such an ugly way to govern, and so unnecessary. Just say, listen, we're in charge, you're not. Go out and hustle. If they did that, it would be so much better for everyone. I'd much rather I'm a bit resentful about being brought up in the UK because of this kind of thing. Like the stupefaction of the BBC. Like, it's awful. And you know, we're taught that it was this kind of high-end intellectual place for intellectual discourse. It's kind of embarrassing. I feel a bit embarrassed and I feel a bit resentful. So I just think that if you had kids now in the UK and you could choose one of those systems, one where everyone just knows where the power is, how it works, and all you've got to do is get on and hustle, it's so much better than lying to children from the moment they're born. Anyway, I'm going to leave it here. I'm writing a Substack at the moment on what's going on in the EU. It's spiritual psyop. My name's Simon Noxon. You can follow me on X, same name, spiritual psyop. And I'll see you in the next video.